Eugene Friesen is CelloMan, a Grammy-award winning cellist and composer who teaches at the Berklee School of Music in Boston, and who integrates the sounds of the natural world into everything he does. He plays the cello as a squirrel might play it, as a bear might play it, as a great master like Pablo Casals played it. His compositions embrace the songs of whales and songbirds. He is also a great believer in listening deeply, in paying profound and contemplative attention, in being truly present in the world, activities that our traditional educations, whether in music or in other disciplines, really attempt to drive out of us. In a sense, Friesen's musical orientation is to go beyond the formalities of his classical training and back to our original state of simply being in the world, making harmonies with our fellow creatures. Maybe I can start by saying I have often said that it's easier to get a PhD than to get rid of one.
I love that. I'm going to use that. That's great.
And it seems to me you were saying the same thing, basically, about classical training.
Yeah, in a way that's true. I mean, of course, classical training has become incredibly efficient at doing what it does, which is creating a kind of supply of the great soloists in that tradition, as well as supplying orchestra musicians for all over the world. But as the demand for those positions go down, there's a great need for us to be teaching creativity and how to serve our communities as opposed to simply playing that repertoire.
Yeah, and that serving our community and learning how to do that in a flexible and fluid way strikes me as what you were bringing to this conference, and that's what they needed to hear.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the whole notion of collaboration, may seem obvious when you're playing chamber music or playing in an orchestra. But then when you're actually creating music from scratch and trying to create a context that serves your community in a new way and maybe synthesizes elements that are new for us to our tradition. In other words, for the Western art music that we study, we don't really have any real footing in Arabic music or Asian music, and actually very little in the rhythmic traditions of Africa or South America either. So these are areas that I think contemporary musicians, no matter what their training should have in order to really reach out to these elements in our communities and create a music that really expresses our community.
You've gone beyond that because you've gone right back to the natural world, which we all share, and you performed that beautiful piece about the Japanese bush warbler that came out from the sound of... Tell me about how you got into the integration of natural sounds into what was very beautiful and very beautiful music on a cello, which is a very traditional instrument.
The cello is, first of all, incredibly versatile. And so that's great. It can, not only play a melody in kind of a soulful way, it has the sound of the human voice, which kind of touches people in a very real way in their bodies. And is also a great instrument for accompanying. It can be a bass instrument, it can be, because of the possibility to play chords, it's very guitar-like too, even harp-like sometimes. So it does have this tremendous versatility, especially when you begin to integrate other ideas from Africa, South America, and other parts of the world. But the kind of habit that I got into the idea for using recorded sounds from the environment really came from Paul Winter, who's been my colleague and my mentor for almost 40 years at this point.
And he invited you to come and play with him, and then your first big experience with integrating the natural sounds was the Gray Whale.
He had just released his album Common Ground in 1978, or 77, I think, which featured the recorded sounds of the eagle, the whale, and the wolf, the American timber wolf. And it was an album that also integrated a lot of different music, jazz, classical, pop, and world music kind of ideas. And he was working toward another album, which eventually came to be called Callings, which was a double album that used a lot more recordings of endangered sea mammals. So, and I think that this experience with the whales down in Baja was the experience that kind of set him on that path. Originally, I think that he was invited to bring the band down to Baja because of the Common Ground album. But then as he had these kind of encounters with the whales, I think that that's what got him to start thinking about doing a whole album of sea mammals.
And you came down and had your own experience.
Yeah, very much so. Well, it's you know, at that point, I don't know that I'd ever been outside for more than a day or two at a time. So just to be outside for a week in itself was extraordinary. It's amazing what that does, isn't it? Just being away from walls. So that had a profound effect. And then being in the sun and the sky and in the presence of these whales every day, you know. Anyway, a game changer.
And you have had a very close encounter with one of the whales.
Indeed, yeah. And it was really the first day that we went out. And maybe it had to be that way because we saw it off in the distance and we're just wondering, you know, how close we could get when suddenly there she was, absolutely right next to our boat.
And just kind of floated up and...
Mm-hmm, yeah. Incredibly slowly, incredibly gracefully. So there was no feeling of you know, threat or intimidation or anything like that. I really think she was just as curious about us as we were about her.
What were you doing in the boat at the time? What activities were going on in the boat?
And it was a small boat, it was just a rowboat. You know, we were just out there. We had just gone out. You know, we were told that there were dozens of mother whales out there. So we knew we would see some, and I just had no idea or expectation that we would be getting that close.
The reason I ask is because I'm a sailor, and you know, I've had a couple of really memorable encounters with whales, and it's been the same sort of thing you described, where they, you know, I would be steering along on quite a calm day, and all of a sudden you hear, and right behind the boat is, you know, a 35-foot whale, and then it comes down and comes up beside the boat and is looking at you with this great, big, dark eye.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do know what you're talking about. But there's also a story, I think it comes back to the 60s maybe. It was a story about a voyaging sailor who was becalmed in mid-Atlantic at some point. And I think either he was a musician or he was playing, no, he was playing classical music, I think, on the radio. So here he is, sitting in this absolutely calm, quiet setting in the middle of the ocean, playing this classical music, and suddenly a whale comes up right beside him and stays and listens. And I thought, as you were telling that story, I thought this would be a story that would delight you.
That is a great story. I love that, yeah. Paul subsequently has gone out many times, and sometimes, or one time in particular, he had his sax with him and a hydrophone, and he was playing his sax so that it could kind of be broadcast down into the water, and he knew that there were humpbacks around. But by his telling, he never really had any impression that they paid any mind to him or responded or anything like that. So.
Well, you certainly do get the sense that whales are interested and curious about and happy to have some kind of closer relationship with the right kind of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it, when you're dealing with creatures like that who in some ways are so kin to us that sometimes it's tempting to attribute all kinds of things that may not be there. It's really wild.
There are enough stories about whales, you know, approaching boats and hanging out with boats, and there are dolphins that are always accompanying boats.
Yeah, and even helping humans, saving them.
Yeah, so the evidence is, you know, at the scientific and quantifiable, but the anecdotal evidence is pretty strong that there's some kind of relationship there. You quoted Mozart as saying something to the effect of that love is the soul of genius, and that's not the exact quote, but it seems to me that when you're talking about an experience like that, you really are open in a way that, to the natural world, in a way that's very powerful in terms of what your own creativity is.
Yeah, I quite agree, and thank you for pointing out that part of the equation, really, because that connection that we feel, which I think is kind of at the very seat of inspiration, is always accompanied by this quality of openness to it, which I also feel is how I feel when I'm really experiencing love. It's a very similar kind of feeling that way. And I know that when I'm working on a project that fills me with the same sense of excitement, you know, that some of the past masters must have felt, when you just don't want to eat You don't want to rest. You don't even want to go to the bathroom. All you can think about is you're in this kind of flow, and you can visualize the end of this and just cannot wait to get it on paper or to finalize this. And that is a feeling too, which really just feels like love. It feels like you're completely opening up from the inside. So to me, it's very entwined with artistry, with so-called genius, with brilliance, even with God. All those words kind of work for me.
And absolutely with nature.
Yeah, right, that's another one.
Somewhere in there you said something to the effect that finding that feeling and staying with that feeling and honoring that feeling is no longer optional. Tell me why it's no longer optional.
Well, I mean, for those, because of the current political situation in America, I think a lot of us kind of feel like we're under siege. And for that reason, it's just obvious that we have to work our smartest and our most efficient game. It's very tempting to get into a kind of a polarizing game, because that's what we see all around us, that kind of polarity that's really seems to be fueled by a lot of fear and trepidation that brings up a lot of negativity inside of us. And so the point is simple, and that is to experience that love, to experience that openness. I believe that's where our truest motivation comes from, and also the genius strategies. The ideas, the strategies that really can help us navigate a course, which may be something actually that the earth is trying to tell us, so that it's not coming from our conniving cunning, it's coming from some external source. And to channel that requires this kind of openness that we're talking about. So I talked about listening, different strategies of listening. As a musician, those are tremendous ways to kind of approach that kind of openness, where you allow these other flashes of intuition and association to happen. So that's why I say it's essential now, because it's just too easy to kind of go with the people screaming at each other modality.
So you need to kind of rise above it, and you were saying, for example, just saying yes to ideas that you loathe, making an argument for an...
As an exercise, I think it's useful. I mean, that's the kind of thing we do in music that ultimately is useful.
Well, yeah, I think it is, and it does get you out of that sort of locking horns syndrome, and maybe it takes, and it's very hard, it's very hard for the other people to counter, right? You know what I mean? You've got a guy who's used to attacking you, and you, in a sense, just kind of step away from the attack and respond with openness.
One of my lawyer friends says that the first lawyer to take a breath becomes the designated listener. As if it's the worst possible thing in the world to have to take a breath and leave any space for your adversary to begin voicing their argument. But in that model, I mean, the implication there is that both sides have a well-rehearsed argument that they're just interested in voicing. And what I'm talking about is an actual conversation where things change and evolve. And that takes flexibility, and that takes the kind of openness that we're talking about. It takes courage to do that, rather than simply kind of shoot from the trenches.
You are making yourself vulnerable.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
There's an Australian Aboriginal tradition that goes right to the heart of this. Tell me about that, because it went by and I found it absolutely fascinating, but I'd like to hear more about it. Yeah,
well, the peoples of Australia have been there for tens of thousands of years, and in some ways their culture is preserved, to some extent, more than other places on the planet, maybe. But they do have this kind of practice called dadiri, which is this deep attunement. It's a deep listening. They refer to it as a listening practice, which is intended to happen outdoors. And it's a simple being mindful of the sounds in the environment. Listening, for me, is a kind of litmus for being in the present moment. Because if you are truly listening, you are in the present moment. And that was the reason that that I wanted to illustrate how easy it is for our minds to become engaged with memories, associations, different triggers, judgments, self-evaluations, etc., that really take us out of a listening mode, that take us out of the present moment. So this practice, I think, is something that is in itself beautiful. First of all, that you would integrate into your lifestyle finding a place in nature where you can listen that way, because that in itself is kind of unusual. You know, in the places where we live, it's hard to find a place where you can really focus on the sounds of nature outdoors. And also to open yourself to the kind of information that might be coming to you through that kind of layered and mysterious language, you know, that the earth speaks, whether it's water, whether it's wind, whether it's the voices of creatures.
And you mentioned, I think I've got this right, the situation where you were expecting someone to speak and they just said, whoa. And basically the command was like, now listen.
Right. That
right?
speechlessness of it, yeah.
Well, what struck me about that is that we did a wonderful interview with an Anishinaabe law professor, but he's, you know, he both was in the British common law tradition, but he's also in the Aboriginal traditions from which he comes. And he and his daughter were talking about people going out together and being out in the woods, and there were moments at which any one of them can, may, and does stop and simply say, whoa, or I don't think that's the single syllable, but it's a single syllable, and everybody stops and listens. And that's really, it's
right.
Same thing.
Yeah, it's like a news bulletin.
Yeah.
Achtung, check this out, this update, you know.
Yeah. Now tell me a little more about the Australian thing, because it sounded to me as though it was kind of like a spiritual discipline. If I were trying to do that, what would I do?
In the language that I read this described, you know, they really were using the language of spirituality in it. And at one point I was wondering whether I could get through a presentation like I gave today here in Eugene without using the word spirit or God or anything like that, you know. Ultimately I decided that was kind of phony to try to do that. But this quote about Dadiri was the only place I think today where I mentioned the word God. So for them, that's how they experience God, as this kind of unifying entity of the cosmos. And listening is one way that they receive these messages. And maybe not directly in sound, but that openness is how that channel gets opened.
It's sort of a deep, mindful attentiveness.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
That sort of thing, and is a process that you go through to do that? I mean, I think you said you go to a special place that in a sense speaks to you in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. As far as I know, that's the process, is simply finding that place and then quieting yourself.
Yeah,
that's what I know about it.
Yeah, sounds kind of Buddhist, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
And then the other kind of listening you mentioned is open listening, which sounds like it's quite closely related, but not quite the same.
Yeah, I kind of, I kind of saw the term open listening as being a little bit more kind of relational. You know, I called it cultural listening, because it's something that I think allows for new understandings to develop in empathy between human beings in conversation. And for that reason, the suggestion was that in conversation and in collaboration and even in negotiation, that it can be a useful tool. Again, not to simply shoot from the trenches, but to enter into a kind of common area with someone with a willingness to create a new understanding. When I teach improvisation with people, or when I engage in improv with a musician, someone who I've never played with before, I kind of have that image for me. I feel that there's a kind of shared area between us, and that I'm placing my attentiveness into this area, and my goal is to really receive there the energy, the intention, and the abilities and the language of the person I'm playing with. So somehow it's a way for me to visualize coming out of my own mind and all the things that I practiced, and just mentally put myself on this blank canvas here that will be shaped by the intention and the personality of my collaborator.
Which takes us back to that initial thing about it being harder to get rid of a PhD than to get one. Harder to get rid of a classical training, right? Because you've got to shuck all that in order to do this, but then you've had some liberating insights about improvisation and how that could work. For example, you don't have to be good.
Yeah, check that out. Yes, no note about that.
And you can't make a wrong note.
It's fun to try.
Whatever note you make is the right note at that time. There's a deep acceptance of that real situation.
Yeah, and when we talk about the musical elements in a way, you know, melody, harmony, rhythm, sound color, and texture, you know, these are things that are really fun to play with in the same way that we encourage our kids to play with art supplies. You know, we don't insist that our kids stay within the lines necessarily. You give your kid art supplies and, you know, she wants to see how it looks on the paper you give her, but also interested how it looks on the wall and on her clothes and on your clothes and how it tastes and, you know, whether you can wear it. I mean, this is really completely a full body thing. And I think that's one of my points, is that we classical musicians aren't overtly encouraged to really take these elements of music and really play with them and rub them all over ourselves and explore them and really get to know them like we know the way through our houses in the dark.
It's a very useful discipline in all kinds of ways, but music is a lovely illustration of, well, I think you quoted Picasso as saying that every child is an artist. The problem is to remain one as you grow older.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're getting back to your base of your inner child.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the child is someone who models that openness that we're talking about, you know, who may live in love, you know, if they're allowed to. But then, you know, a child doesn't have the expertise. It doesn't have really the context, the skill, the experience to create something abstract and abstractly beautiful and abstractly meaningful. Some children's art is just delightfully naive and even beautiful to look at. But it's even more beautiful when you see someone, well, let's talk about Picasso, you know, someone who you look at his early work and you can see that his craftsmanship is absolute. You know, he can depict anything with great graphic detail. So the work that he does, he's consciously coming to a new understanding, a new place, maybe not consciously, but he's allowing that new perception to happen. And that's when I think it becomes really meaningful, because for those of us who work so hard to develop our craft, you know, it's really tempting to plant our flag there and want to let the world know that we've got this. And it's quite another thing to kind of set that aside and says, okay, well, that's a spoon, that's a fork, you know, what are we going to do with it now, really? It's a tool.
Yes, and there's this tendency to think of yourself, when you've put in the requisite, 10,000 hours to achieve mastery, to think of yourself as sort of finished. Do you know what, like in a way that a product is finished, you know, arrived, yeah. And to shuck that, and you quoted Fritz Perls, lose your mind and your soul.
Come to your senses.
Lose your mind,
lose
come
your
to your
mind
senses.
and come to your
I
senses.
didn't get the quote.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I got an email from a cellist in one of the great orchestras in America, and he was saying, you know, I've worked really hard from the time I was a kid to play the cello, and I can play the cello really well, and I got this amazing job, but I don't like coming to work, and I don't really like music anymore, you know. And I think he was writing to me just because he knew what the answer was for himself, that he wanted to find a pathway to engage with music in a new way, but didn't quite know how to get there. And so that's a little bit about what we're talking about, you know, is that, and I mentioned it a little bit in my talk too, about how the kind of listening that we're encouraged to engage in when we evaluate our playing so closely, as we really need to do to attain high levels of performance, is a kind of listening that is really not about the deeper spiritual meaning of music necessarily. It's something that is about the technical aspect of reproducing a written part. Now, mind you, there's plenty of great artists who intuitively bring their artistry and their sense of soul into their performance. So I don't think that we're in danger of losing that at all. I'm just pointing out that in our training, that's not necessarily valued. It's valued when we say, well, so-and-so person really has that certain gift of communication, but we don't really know how to teach that. We can model it, but we can't really teach that.
But you did think that creativity could be cultivated.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's one of the great takeaways, is that you can do that. Dadiri, I think, is a great way of just sitting and allowing nature to talk to you. That's one way, and maybe meditation would do the same thing. But there's just from reading about creativity, you come up with other ideas too. You notice that one idea was visiting foreign countries. Just having that quality of perception when you realize that people live differently than you, have different values, and even live in places where the light is quite different than where you're accustomed to living in. In fact, they even noticed that people showed enhanced creativity when they just were looking at pictures of other cultures with artifacts and information about other cultures, that taking these little creativity tests after experience like that, they proved that they did better, having just been able to put their imagination out there into the world in a different way. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is, yeah. And, it strikes me that, again, what you bring to this broad conversation is having done a lot of experimentation, a lot of taking it, a lot of creative leaps and creative chances. And basically, you're able to, I think, if you're trying to figure out a strategy for some kind of environmental issue, that kind of perspective would be tremendously useful. So how does something come about like the beautiful piece of music that you did that came from the Japanese bush warbler? For me, that's almost impenetrably mysterious that you'd be able to do that. What's it like for you, who actually does it?
Well, I can tell you about the genesis of that particular piece, and every piece has its own story, in a way. That particular one was, we had come to a museum in the mountains above Kyoto, the Miho Museum. It's a beautiful museum designed by I.M. Pei, and kind of tucked into the mountainside in this ingenious architectural way, so that really the nature of the mountain is completely honored in there. But the museum, as we were visiting it, has these beautiful galleries, each of which has a different quality because of the different kind of spiritual art from Asia that it holds, but also because of the architecture of each place seems quite different sonically to me, that I noticed even when I was walking through. So I asked if I could bring my cello in and just try it in there. And to my surprise, they said okay. And then I just loved playing in there. So when we got home, we petitioned the museum for permission to come back and actually make some recordings there. And again, they said okay. So we spent, I think, 10 nights in the Miho Museum. They close at 8 in the evening and open at 8 in the morning. So we had those 12 hours, which is perfect. New York time, was absolutely, the clock was flipped around, so it was like showing up to work at 8 in the morning. And each morning when we left, we would hear this bush warbler. Every morning, it was there. And the recording we were doing was mostly improv. I was playing some Bach on this recording. I have a copy, I'll leave it for you. But then this kind of chord progression kind of emerged from one of my improvs at the museum. And then when I put it together with the Japanese bush warbler, it just seemed right, The intuition was there to do that, and it does seem beautiful.
So you actually already had the improv piece. And
It was happening simultaneously. Okay. Well, you know, at the same period of time, within a week or two,
Yeah, but the interest and the inspiration that would lead you to say, well, okay, I've worked, who knows where the chord progression comes from, right? If it comes from...
Yeah, it was just an accident.
Yeah, but then you see that it'll fit with the bush warbler, and that's a kind of a magical thing too.
There's nothing in our training that would say that that would work, you know, or nothing that would suggest to try that. It's, again, I don't know why.
But if you've been working at improv as you have been, there's a certain, I mean, I can't see how you could possibly have gotten to the place you had to get to if you hadn't been doing improv, because with other musicians, you're reacting and interreacting to the sound that they're making, and now you've got this sound from another source, and you're in a sense kind of jamming with the bird. Is that a fair description of what the process felt like?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's, you know, when you're jamming with someone, you're really changing how you respond based on what you hear. In this case, it wasn't exactly like that because, you know, we couldn't get a bush warbler into the museum and to speak on cue. So it was really just really evoking the kind of quality in that kind of listening, you know, when I encountered that bird outside the museum, and just having that somehow inhabit me, you know, when I was improvising. And then, because I did a lot of improvising in the museum, you know, but to locate that one particular series of chords and time signature and kind of dynamic that just felt like it was a home for that bird call. And in fact, it seemed to work out.
There's something quite magical about
Thank you.
that. Okay, because today you had the cello and an electronic cello at that. Right?
Yeah, today I brought my electric cello, yeah, and it was using a looper. So I can, you know, I improvise a kind of a prelude to it, and then begins this descending chord progression, which when I perform solo, I can do as a loop. In other words, I record it while I'm performing it, and then the loop just begins to play back that same progression while I can extemporize over the top of it.
And that loop was recorded right there?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
I thought
okay,
this was a pre-recorded...
Right, live looping.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Well, that, you know, even though it's a device and you're making a recording, at least it still feels like part of a live performance.
Well, it is.
It is a live performance.
I mean, it's a live performance. You've just found a way of making it repeat.
Right.
But
it's also a recording
same thing
session.
You played just right now.
A live
right?
recording session.
Yeah. Tell me about CelloMan, because this is another way that you seem to get back to that place of innocence and the relationship with children and the playfulness of this whole approach.
Yeah, CelloMan is a program that I've done thousands of performances of at this point. I started doing it in the mid-90s. And at that time, I was living in Vermont and supporting my family, and that became a cottage industry for some years, just doing that. And so I worked with a mask maker and a theater director to develop this program for young listeners. And the director I was working with, Rob Faust, really helped me dig into my personal experiences to kind of create the script for this program. So the piece with the humpback whale was really created for this program. And then there's a whole other narrative, you know, a long script. It's about a 50-minute program that involves me playing as a couple of different masked characters, including in some of the shows early on, just to show the different personality of the cello. I have a squirrel mask. Actually, I meant to bring that on this trip because I thought that would be a great way to end the program today at the conference by doing this little shtick with a beautiful squirrel head made by brilliant mask maker Rob Faust. And also a kind of very lovable big bear head. So, you know, with CelloMan, I wanted every kid to feel like they had a friend who played the cello, and also to show that different personalities, you know, like these mask characters, would approach the instrument in a different way and could use that instrument to express something unique inside of them. So that was the whole point of having the masked characters, as well as the obvious entertainment value for everybody, really. I started, it took me 2 or 3 years of doing that in front of school kids before I realized that my solo shows, when I play for adults, they're actually the same audience. They all want the same kind of humor, and the mask stuff seems to work great for adults too.
So you do it with adults as well?
Sometimes, not the whole show, but aspects of it. Yeah.
Okay, so that sounds, which it takes us back again to your inner 7-year-old, right? I mean, it's you with showing your inner 7-year-old.
Well, I have 6 children.
Mine. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it seems like the last 30 years there's been a 7-year-old in my life. So.
That's wonderful.
It's very helpful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Is it hard to go back into the classical tradition? Because you're a professor at Berklee, and I presume you're doing some traditional music education with some very gifted people.
Well, Berklee College of Music is a different kind of conservatory. It's a place that really features the inclinations of the students, many of whom are more interested in pop music and folk music and jazz and so like that. So our emphasis is really not on classical music exclusively. I think we intend to be the kind of conservatory that we all wish we had gone to. The conservatory that really values these rhythmic traditions from all over the world, playing with very different scales from the Middle East, from Arabic music, experimenting with sounds and instruments from all over the world and exploring those cultures in a respectful way, and a way that any kind of gourmand would approach anything, just with a curiosity about and a love for sound and a curiosity how they make it and why they make it that way, how they celebrate, what they worship and how they use the music is really interesting. So those are all become kind of new colors for our canvas.
Do you mean you become a sort of perpetual student yourself kind of thing?
Very much so, and I learn so much from my students. Please don't ever tell them. I mean, this whole thing is such a scam. It's really, I'm constantly learning stuff from my students, and also being directed to other music in the world that I normally wouldn't find. My kids are the same way. I learn a lot about music from what they love. Yeah.
So it keeps you, I have a sense that a great many of us kind of fixate on the music that we first got to know and love when we were fairly young, and then after that it's all kind of the noise of the youth and we don't pay too much attention to it.
Well, something that, some of the early music I practiced were the Bach cello suites. And those suites seem to be something that never grow old for me. I mean, if anything, my love for them, appreciation of them, and understanding of them has continued to develop, over the 50 years that I've been looking at them and playing them. So that part of it I'm really intrigued by. And other aspects of classical music, the things that just lit me on fire so deeply as a young music student. Sometimes I will hear that and I can go back into that space too. And sometimes I hear it and it just kind of feels like a relic. But it is a tradition that I deeply admire and appreciate. And I'm also grateful to be part of this kind of wave of reintegrating that into a kind of a more living context, in our culture. In other words, that it doesn't become an obsession or a fetish to play it exactly the way they played it in Mozart's time, on exactly that kind of instrument, but that we can take the quality of that music, really appreciate it as an insight into history, and certainly as a kind of template of masterful craftsmanship, and learn from it from those reasons, and then create something that really speaks relevantly of who we are right now.
There's kind of a respectful conversation between then a person who's doing something new with it and the music, the great classical music that they're using.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that was the word that when I was thinking about open listening, that was the phrase that came to my mind, was sincere consideration. And I like that phrase because it does it does allow that kind of openness to have something land, you know, in the best way possible.
There's something very mysterious about a great work, though, too, isn't there? I mean, like what you were saying about the Bach cello suites, is that you discover more every time you play it. And as the years go by, you play it differently, and you hear it differently, and you understand it differently.
That was put in a very charming way by one of my favorite cellists, the Dutch cellist Anner Bilsma. And he was giving a workshop on the Bach cello suites, and he had this famous recording of them on RCA that came out in 1980. And this was in the 80s, and he came and performed them in our town in Vermont. And his performance was very different from the recorded version. And someone at the workshop the next day said, you know, I noticed the way you played that saraband was totally different than you recorded it. And he said, yeah, and he was looking at his cello, and he said, you know, sometimes it's like being a ventriloquist when your dummy actually does talk. That was his way of saying, you know, that's how the cello wanted to do it last night. What can I do?
Isn't that beautiful?
I love that.
Yeah, yeah.
With Bach, I mean, I just always think you can't keep a good man down. You know, I mean, no matter who plays Bach, Bach always wins. It just still sounds like Bach, and it still sounds great, even if it's a quartet of trombones, you know, or whatever. It's Bach.
It occurred to me that I actually wrote down a little phrase, which I think maybe is a good one to bring out at this point. Yeah, that you had been looking for and showing us the way to a meeting place of art, spirit, and action.
Is that great?
Is that close?
I love that.
Yeah?
I love that. I want to borrow that.
You may have it, but I thought that you know, through the avenue of the music, approaching the spiritual matters, but really helping people to find a place where they didn't have so much fear, where they didn't have so much anxiety, where they were in a sense centered and calm, and thus, to use the cliched word, empowered to go out and do what needed to be done.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, with the analogy of free improv, the idea is to take all the hard work you've done, all the things you've studied, and then to somehow find a personal expression for it. And for me, that came through jamming, through improvising, and through just disregarding some of these things that I had found a little intimidating or crippling even, you know, in my training.
Getting rid of your PhD.
Yeah, getting rid of my PhD is another great phrase.
Well, I learned that when I tried to, because I have a PhD in English and I'm a writer, and there was a long period when it was really crippling because I had all the critics sitting on my shoulders and saying, wow, this doesn't sound much like Shakespeare. But you know, it took me a long time to get them to leave me alone and, you know, get off my
That's
you know,
so
leave me
cool,
alone.
yeah.
Yeah.
We did a workshop in Vermont 2 years ago called Vermont Story House. And I had a couple of my favorite poets come there. Coleman Barks, who's the translator of the Rumi poetry into English, and Marie Howe is the poet laureate of New York. And Marie is a extraordinary, almost vicious editor and teacher. And at some point, a poet came up and read a poem that I just couldn't understand. It had some very dazzling language in it, and some words that I thought were intriguing next to each other. And Marie came up with a pen and took out, this was about a 16-line poem, and she crossed out 26 words. They were almost like all adjectives. And he read the poem again, and suddenly it was just like drinking pure water, you know? I understand exactly what the poem was about. It was very clear, it was simply stated, it was perfect. And he himself, his PhD had completely clouded his intention, you know? That's a fun way of putting it. the idea of actually communicating with the whales, for example, through music, is something that I haven't received any, convincing documentation about. The whale researcher who I know the best is Roger Payne, himself a cellist, which is part of the bond that we had together. And he studied these songs in great detail. He's graphed out their songs, the timing of it, such that they were able to recognize that these are songs. In other words, repeated series of sounds and melodic fragments and whistles and clicks and stuff like that are repeated exactly the same. And these songs can be, many minutes in length, almost an hour in length, that they then repeat verbatim, and the whales in a certain community will all be singing that same extraordinary long kind of song. But as far as I know, everything that I've read, everything that I've talked about with Roger, they've never really understood exactly what motivates the whale to sing a given song. It's whether it's self-soothing or whether it's some kind of news update is really mysterious. So, and then, as I mentioned to you, Paul, has gone out with hydrophones and played his horn down there, hoping to have some quality of interplay or interaction. But again, there was nothing that where he ever felt like, I was really jamming with this one player down there. So for now, it's really this kind of dead eerie. It's, I don't know anything about this, but it's something, I think it's called abraxas, some kind of religion where people stare into the fire and receive messages from the fire, and intuitively I understand that, because when you think about the shapes that a fire makes, it's something that our forebears were looking at too, tens of thousands of years ago. We were looking at the shapes of fire, and so there is this kind of commonality that puts us back into a kind of an archetypal state of being. And I think Dadiri, listening to whale song, listen to birds, listen to the stream, is a similar kind of thing. It may be a thing that helps to awaken this sense of lineage of our species on the planet. And so perhaps that is one consideration for how this is a kind of communication or a kind of opening that allows fresh information to come in. But in terms of actually jamming, no, don't have any experience with that. It's all imagination and kind of inspiration.
Yeah, my suspicion is that there's communication going on all around us in ways that we don't get. And it may be that the whale and the human are passing each other relatively closely in terms of communication, yet without quite making it.
Did you hear this? It was an interview with an author who was talking about how trees communicate.
I didn't hear the interview, but I've been reading The Hidden Life of Trees.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Isn't that
is
fascinating?
It absolutely is.
And different people were talking about the relationship that they had with specific trees. The tree that they grew up with, a tree that they would always return to when they were desolate, or that when they needed to be alone, they would go to a certain tree. And he was responding to this. People were calling into this talk show and saying, I have this one tree. Does that tree really recognize me and know me? Does it remember me? Is that what you're saying? And what he was saying is that the speed of their communication and the speed of their receptivity is so incredibly slow that us coming around a tree and spending a couple of hours with it, even over the course of decades, would be just like a mosquito coming around us and flying away. It's the whole sense of time is completely different and doesn't allow for that kind of exchange.
Eugene Friesen, cello virtuoso, educator, and composer. This is one of our green interviews focused on the natural world and the arts, which also includes our interviews with the painter Robert Bateman, composer and guitarist Scott McMillan and his librettist Jennifer McMillan, and poets Brian Brett and Robert Michael Pyle. Environmentalism is often dismissed as grim and gloomy, but the gifts that all these green artists bring to us is a lovely blend of piercing vision, mindfulness, and delight. What could be more beautiful? For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.